You're watching Reality Check. As tensions simmer on the border between India and China, calls are going up for an economic boycott of the dragon. Is this possible? Is it feasible to boycott a country with such deep links? But this is what is happening. The Railways has cancelled a key Chinese contract. A 470 crore contract has been cancelled for signalling equipment. The Railways' official line, though, is that they are upset with the pace of work. BSNL, also the state-run telecom giant, has been asked not to use Chinese equipment. They will not be using Chinese equipment for their 4G upgradation. Okay, but the question remains that is this realistic? Is this feasible? We're going to present to you 10 slides, 10 graphics that raises serious questions about whether this is reality or rhetoric to economically boycott China. Let's look at the first graphic. Let's look at the balance of payments. India is importing from China 74 billion. Exports to China only 18 billion. So a huge gap between how much we import, almost $74 billion worth from China, export only $18 billion. And what is it that India is purchasing? Let's take a look at all those areas, the big areas of which India depends on China. Antibiotics, 81% comes from China. Pharma ingredients, 75%. Telecom equipment, 73%. Semiconductor devices, 82%. This is all research by Anand Krishnan of Brookings. We'll have him on in a second. But it's not just what we are importing from China. Chinese investment, Anand Krishnan's research finds, is surging in India. It was 1.6 billion in 2014 when the Modi government came to power. By 2017, it had surged almost 5 times to $8 billion. So that's a huge jump of how much China is actually investing in India. And where is it investing? Where are these investments coming? Let's put that map graphic on the screen. And this gives you an idea of the scale of plants and factories and units, from automobiles to pharmaceuticals to electronics and components across the country, where all China has got its investments in state after state after state. It's not just that. Indian infrastructure is increasingly powered by Chinese state-run firms. So the Railways may have cancelled a contract for a couple of 100 crores. BSNL may be scrapping contracts, but look at the scale. And these are just some examples. China's Railway Rolling Stock Corporation setting up a $63.4 million plant in Haryana. China's Railway Construction Corporation, a $5.7 billion they won to build 3,000 kilometers of highways across India. The Xinjiang Group, which could originally have links to the Chinese army, $1.25 billion iron ore plant coming up in Karnataka. And the greatest investment is in, of course, India's power infrastructure. What we're about to play you are information from a CEA report, the Central Electricity Advisory, and their report. Their report, if you go through it and you look at all the lists of equipment and manufacturers, you look at all the different power plants and you look at where they've imported their machinery from, and you look at that and you just find that again and again it is China, China, China and China, with of course the state-owned Bharat Heavy Electronics Limited, BHEL, also supplying some of the equipment. But a bulk of it, 75%, one estimate suggests, of India's power plants use Chinese equipment. And again, the other big area which we all know, because we're all familiar with it in a much more intimate sense, is the dependence on Chinese-made cell phones. Recent research shows that that share of the Indian mobile market of Chinese phones has actually increased to almost 70% are Chinese made. And the rest are just 32%. So that's huge. And who, of course, are these brands? These are all the brands that we now know so well. Xiaomi, this is the big brand. Vivo, Oppo, Realme, all of these are the big Chinese cell phone brands. And they are not just, by the way, anymore imported from China. They're increasingly now made in India. They have factories and plants across India, making it even harder to try to treat it or even boycott it as some kind of Chinese product. Xiaomi, for example, has 7 factories in India, including in Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and Noida, said to have invested close to $1,000 million. Vivo and Oppo, plants in Noida, research and development centers, estimated investment $600 million. Huawei, which has a global service center, R&D center, plans to open 1,000 retail stores. Again, investment close to $310 million. And last but not the least, increasingly, India's startups are seeing a surge of investment from the Chinese. No longer just necessarily the Chinese government, but the Chinese private sector. Every one of our unicorns, as these startups are called, these are startups with valuations of over $1 billion, has Chinese investment. Alibaba invested in Big Basket, Paytm, Snapdeal, Zomato. Tencent, which is Chinese again, invested in Byju's, Ola, Flipkart, Swiggy. Xiaomi has invested in City Mall, Hungama Media, and ShareChat finds Gateway House. All right. So that's the scale of the Chinese investment in India. Can we shake off the dragon's economic chains that easily? Joining us tonight on the show, Vikram Kirloskar, Vice Chairman, Toyota Kirloskar Motor, former President CII was with us. Sunil Alag, Independent Business Consultant, joining us. Rajan Mathew, Director General, Cellular Operators Association of India. And Anand Krishnan, journalist at The Hindu, visiting fellow at Hong Kong University, someone who's reported and researched extensively from and on China. Now, Vikram Kirloskar, let me start with you, sir. Pleasure to have you as always. Tell me, given, as we've just outlined, the scale of Chinese economic presence and investment in India, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, many of these numbers are conservative. Is it even realistic to now start thinking about some kind of Chinese boycott policy, to start cancelling Chinese contracts and whatnot?
See, it is very clear that the Chinese have done extremely well economically in the last 20, 25 years. They've become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. It is absolutely clear. A lot of businesses around the world depend on their supply chains for parts from China. I was reviewing my own company, Toyota Kirloskar Motors, what is our situation on parts coming from China. We went on a very high localization drive last 15 years. We have 1 or 2% parts coming through suppliers, sub-suppliers to us. We're looking for different sources. But if you look at different sectors, pharma, you talked about pharma, which is critical for us. It's critical for our health in India. I think it is going to be very difficult, not only for India, but for anyone in the world to just say, I'll shut off things from China from tomorrow. It's very, very difficult. It's obvious. If we take a policy that on a sovereign basis, that no, some of the things that are happening are not acceptable to us, then we'll have to really work hard to figure out alternate sources. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to hurt industry definitely for some time. But that's a choice as a country we have to make. It's a choice as a government and the people we have to make.
Well, I agree with you, because again, this is not to take away from China's terrible actions on the border, and this is something we all feel very strongly about. But at the same time, as you said, that just simply trying to cut off the economic tap could actually be shooting ourselves in the foot, because Chinese investment, Chinese funding is powering so much of our industry. You mentioned pharma, but just look at cell phones. Look at power infrastructure.
Frankly,
figures suggesting that close to almost 3/4 of power plants have Chinese machinery.
I'm not so worried about money coming from China, very frankly. We can find money from elsewhere. We can find resources elsewhere. We don't have those resources, there are other things we can figure out. But there are certain materials in supply chains for various industries, whether it's pharma, whether it's automotive, whether it's power sector, whether it's electronics, which they have monopolized around the world. And to find those parts is going to be more difficult. I think you can definitely, once you make an effort, you can find them, but it can't be overnight. But let me also say, on behalf of myself at least, if the government says and if the people in India and if we are badly treated at the border, I would go for trying to find another source.
Right.
For at least whatever I can do to find other
you would say that you would be behind that.
I will be behind the government.
Okay, but you said that your exposure to China, or at least to Chinese equipment, is sure. But you said yours is a fairly limited, minimal exposure.
Yeah.
Right. Yours may be limited. Others perhaps may not have that luxury. But Anand Krishnan, fantastic research by you.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Kirloskar, do try and hang on if you can. I want to come back to you. But I just want to go to Anand Krishnan because terrific research by you, Anand, putting together all of that data about the depth and extent and also the changing nature of China's economic engagement or involvement in India. But what you were pointing out is also important, that those figures you mentioned, that the investment has gone from about $1 billion to about 6 or 8 billion is also an underestimate. The numbers could be much higher because there are many ways that money comes in which masks the Chinese identity. And that would also make it even harder to figure out when you start getting into boycotts and cancelling contracts. Is it China or is it not China?
Yeah, that's right. Since a lot of it comes from third-party countries or even Chinese subsidiaries in other countries. But I completely agree with what was just said, and I think that we have to be smart about it. I think that boycotting all investments from China and all trade with China makes no sense if you look at China's position in global supply chains. And I think that the question that we have to debate is what kind of investment that we want from China and what kind of investment that we need to be wary about, especially in light of recent events. I think if Chinese companies are manufacturing in India and giving jobs to people in India, you'd be shooting yourselves in the foot by saying that, we don't want any and all Chinese money, including in greenfield projects. The problem for India is most of the investment hasn't been coming in greenfield type of projects. They've been coming in acquiring startups, in acquiring stakes in companies, including in pharma companies. And I think that is a point of concern for the Indian government, which was why you had this amendment to the FDI rules. And I think there is an argument to be made, especially if you look at the telecom sector, and if you look at Chinese presence in 4G equipment and now undergoing trials for 5G, I think there are red flags that we have to be worried about. So I think it's more about us being smart about what kind of investment we need from China that suits our interests. And a blanket ban is going to hurt us as well.
Right. Sunil Alagh, you have at times defended this government's economic positions, but on this one, do you feel that this is perhaps an overreaction? Again, as I said, there's a right to be aggrieved with China, Chinese army, what they've done. But when you start getting into a boycott, what are you going to boycott? Are you going to start boycotting Oppo and Vivo phones, which are used by, as we found, close to 70% of Indians? Are you going to start or stop using Big Basket, Paytm, Snapdeal, Zomato, Byju's, Ola, Flipkart? Where does it end?
Look, I mean, we tend to swing one way or the other. Look, there are many gray areas within which we have to operate now because, look, China is using its military strength, moving into a particular area and put themselves into a negotiating table. We have to start cancelling contracts and telling them that's where we come from. We use that in the negotiating table. So the question is that tomorrow morning you can't ban, as Vikram has said, you can't ban all Chinese products. But anybody who has set up a manufacturing unit is giving labor, is giving employment, is giving everything. That I don't think we can start tomorrow morning. Look, America has a disastrous balance of payments with China, and yet the president has said we're going to ban all Chinese products with forcing Indians to make it. Now, it might take 6 months to 9 months for us to start making it, but look, there are many products which we can make, but we are buying it from outside because or we are importing it because it's cheaper. And China, with its mass production, is making product which is cheaper. Look at Japan. When you go to buy a TV, a Sony TV, it's more expensive in Japan than it is in India. And the Japanese have said, we are willing to pay more for Indian product for Japanese. So therefore, I'm just saying that, look, tomorrow morning, nobody has said ban everything from China.
But you're saying that if you're cancelling contracts, no, fair enough. But you're saying let's start cancelling contracts. Like, for example, the railways is doing that.
1 second.
You're saying railways is doing that. Again, hold on. I'm not disagreeing with you. Let me ask the question. I'm saying if you're going to start cancelling contracts, like BSNL has been told, now cancel your contracts with Chinese companies for 4G equipment to upgrade. Doesn't that put BSNL at a disadvantage straight away?
No, not at all.
Where are they going to get that 4G equipment from?
No. Why are you not going to the South Koreans to tell them to upgrade? No, 1 second. There are many other countries in the world. Why are you going to China? Because it's cheaper. That's all. Because it's cheaper. The other countries can come into and replace the Chinese if you want. But at this point of time, as the journalist and also Vikram has said, that look, we can't do it tomorrow morning. But we have to come from a position of strength to the negotiation table. Look, China is not going to get back in the border because they think they are militarily stronger. If we are economically stronger, we have to start hurting them and use the negotiating power. And in the period of 1 year now, build your own manufacturing units. Why is Apple moving out and coming to India to manufacture phones?
In 1 year.
Get them.
Okay. Rajan Matthews. Well, can we, we've not turned out to be that manufacturing powerhouse in, 50, 60 years, and which we should be, but we've not. So can we really turn around in a year? I don't know. But anyway, Rajan Matthews, DG Cellular Operators Association of India. What is your take on this? Because obviously the cell phone sector, the telecommunication sector is where China has a huge footprint in India. What is your take to this business where the government has already started, at least as a starting point, they've started cancelling government contracts, for cell phone equipment and so on. Has that instructions or have such instructions also come to you as to the private sector?
So, Mr. Jain, thank you very much. It's very difficult to talk dispassionately about China after 20 of our brave hearts have died and been killed, but let me try. I think the first and foremost point that we need to make is that we really need to bifurcate the decision-making process on the geopolitical front and on the commercial front. They may converge at some point, but I believe it's a little too early to try and meld them at this point. The reason I say this is because, first of all, the Chinese companies in all of these various sectors have come in at the invitation of the government. They did not sneak in at night. They've made their investments up front because there were policies in place from the government that incentivized and invited these folks, and they've just basically come. Therefore, we can't disenfranchise that whole period. This is what happened when you try and nationalize companies and effectively do the same thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we need to understand is to put this in perspective in terms of acting from our own self-interest. Let me give you the numbers. $122 billion is Huawei's annual sales number, right? We contribute $1 billion to that number from India, right? We would get lost in the rounding. And the point I want to make is that these types of embargoes and boycotts are very blunt instruments. You've seen it globally. There's plenty of leakage. Enforcing it is very tough. And so really, we must find a better way to address the issue that we are faced with. And as you rightly point out, we are not going to change this overnight. Where do we need to focus on? I think if you look at the telecom side, we have to focus on R&D, we have to focus on IPR generation, and we have to look at these investments before we get a reasonable
but I just had a question. Okay, I had a question for you though, which I asked earlier. I'm going to repeat it. Have you, as private manufacturers, private cell phone, telecom companies, manufacturers association, have you got any instructions at all from the government that you also need to start cancelling contracts, or you can't get into any further agreements with the Chinese?
Not at all. We haven't received any such instructions. I understand that the government can do it for government procurement.
Okay.
It would be very, very tough to begin to impose that on private operators.
Okay. So Vikram Kilorskar, that's an important point that Rajan Matthews makes, that it is difficult to be dispassionate at this time, but the fact is that it's the same government which actually encouraged and fostered all this Chinese investment.
Yes, but the same government which fostered Chinese investment was not expecting a border situation. I mean, let's look at even if you look at it dispassionately, if you look at the border situation, the clash has happened somehow.
Yes.
Okay. This is post-clash, not pre-clash. Things change after events. And to my mind, it cannot be done immediately, but if the people of India and the government think and they believe that this clash was not done if there are issues with the clash, it is an unfair basis, and they say that in your course of your business, next year or next 12 months, please try to see how you can find other suppliers and things. I would certainly start working on it.
Right. Okay. Anand Krishnan, you think that the Chinese would have factored this in when they escalated at the border, that there would be an economic backlash, there could even be an economic hit?
Well, Srinivasan, I think the point that I would like to make in light of what was just said is that while we have to be smart about what kind of investments we want from China and what kind of investments we need to be vigilant about, I think that on one level, it can't be business as usual after what happened on Monday and what has been happening over the past month. And I think that at least in some areas and some sectors, we have to have a rethink on how we are engaging with China. And I would say top of the list would be whether or not we include Chinese companies in 5G trials. I think if you have growing concerns about security issues with China, I think it would be very, very foolhardy to say, let's treat them equivalent as we would with European companies. And I think this border clash and the last month's events should prompt a rethink in some sectors and how we are engaging with China. At the same time, to your question, I don't know if this will deter Chinese behavior or not, especially as someone just pointed out, India isn't really a huge destination, even though the numbers are increasing. I think over the last 4 years, I think we rank about 30 in terms of overseas destinations for Chinese outward investment. Whether that will deter Chinese actions when it's on the border,
it is about 30,
it remains to be seen.
Right. So, Sunil Alag, in conclusion though, what you're saying is that you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere, but it could take time. But in the process, the worry, Sunil Alag, is that we are already facing economic pain. We were already in distress before this entire COVID catastrophe. Now the economy is getting worse. Now to start rolling the dice with China, with trying to cut back on either investments or on funding or on projects or imports, which, as you said, are cheap, but that's what makes it competitive. That's what gives you the competitive advantage, that you get these cheap imports. Is this the time to start rolling the dice? Is that going to also be a challenge for the government if they're going to push ahead with this?
No, but China has already rolled the dice on the border. It was their move. And therefore, for us not to sit back and today and say, look, we're going to do nothing about it, is equally ridiculous. And I am firmly of the belief that tomorrow morning you can't stop it.
Right.
But if you start like, why are we importing slippers and stuff like that? At least stop all the non-essentials tomorrow morning. Ban those imports. And the government, being a democracy, is never going to ask the private sector that stop and start throwing out all the Chinese products. It's for us to react. Once the people of India decide that, look, we are not going to buy Chinese products, then maybe the machinery and all that have come into India will stay in India. Nobody's saying throw those machines out. But at least the new contracts, you've got South Koreans, you've got Japanese, you've got Americans, you've got Europeans who are ready to, Ericsson is ready to move in with their 5G. Why do you pay a little extra? That is what Japan has done. But that is the sacrifice the people are going to make. That's my only point. I mean, I agree with everybody that, look, it won't happen tomorrow morning, but you got to start.
Okay, the sacrifice.
Otherwise, forget it. I mean, Chinese are going to ride over you militarily as well as economically tomorrow morning. Yeah.
Okay. Well, of course, as Anant was pointing out, that even if you do start to scale it down, will it really dent China? Because we are not such a big player for China. So that's another question. But anyway, let's see how this actually plays out. We'll have to see to what extent, if at all, we will push ahead with this Boycott China movement. But that's all the time we have on Reality Check. Thank you all so much for joining.